today's speaker. He's Michael Barbaro. He's a staff writer at the Washington Post. Michael actually grew up in Connecticut, and he's an SJP alum. He participated in the program while he was in high school. Then he was editor-in-chief of the YDN, where he directed SJP, like the 8 of us are doing now. And now it's the Washington Post, like I said, covering financial issues, right, Michael?
Yeah.
So, without further ado, here's Michael.
Hey. So I should have passed this around earlier. I know you guys are in the middle of editing, so I know you want to get to it. So I'm not gonna speak for too long, but I want to talk about 2 things. One is the Washington Post, and the second is how you interview really important people when you don't have a clue what you're talking about, which is what I do every day. So as Ray said, I grew up in Connecticut, and I drove down to Yale all the time when I was in high school and dreamed of running the Yale Daily News because I wanted to be a journalist. And sort of by the grace of God, I got to do that. And it's a fantastic career being a journalist and meeting people you really don't deserve to meet, going places for free you probably don't deserve to go to, and sitting in on some of the most fascinating events in America and in the world. And I'm only 25, and I'm very, very lucky to be at the Washington Post. A lot of my colleagues are at much smaller newspapers, and the work that they're doing is absolutely as interesting as what I do. It just seems like what I do is slightly more prestigious, but at the end of the day, we're all sitting at a blank screen at 5 o'clock, sort of pulling our hair out, and it's torture, and it always will be. So let's talk a little bit about the Washington Post, which is a daily newspaper you may have heard of. So just to see how familiar you guys are with the Post, can anyone tell me anything about the Washington Post besides the fact that Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein worked there? Anything at all? Anything at all? You. What do you know about the Washington Post?
Absolutely nothing.
Okay. How about it's published in Washington, and it's not as big as the New York Times. It's not as big as the Wall Street Journal. It's not as big as USA Today. But because it's the newspaper of the capital of the United States, it's sort of like the nation's local newspaper. And God, these are awfully boring sections, some of these, but it's got a circulation of about 1 million people. And as I said, because it's in Washington, it has this enormously outsized influence over politics. And the President of the United States reads this paper even when he's on vacation for a month in Texas. And the Post is one of those rare newspapers that's owned by a family rather than a huge public company like Miami Herald or the Detroit News, any of those newspapers. So we're run by the Graham family, and as a result, we're not as subject to the pressures of public companies that have to make a lot of profit. For example, like the New Haven Register, which is owned by a publicly traded company and has suffered tremendously as a result. If you've lived here, you've probably read the newspaper. You probably know what I'm talking about. You're going to see by the number of sections and the absolute breadth of what we do that this is a really significant newspaper. And as you enter journalism, you should be really aware of sort of what a newspaper that you're reading is capable of and incapable of. And just one of the things that you should always notice about a newspaper like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, is whether a lot of the stuff is written by the staff of the newspaper, whether they really put their own imprint on the newspaper. And this is something the Post does really well. I mean, everything in here, with very few exceptions, is written by the staff of the Washington Post. And as you read something like the New Haven Register, you'll see that there's a lot of content from other groups, and they're sort of cobbling it together every day. And what that tells you is that we really care about our product, put a lot of money into making it our own product, and giving it a unique sort of depth. That's why we can have 25 or 30 people abroad in a place like Iraq, where you get just a few voices from the Associated Press or any other kind of news organization elsewhere. Anyway, that's all sort of boring, but does anyone have any questions about the Washington Post before I talk about interviewing? Anything you've been burning to know about the Washington Post? Doesn't seem like you have been. Yeah?
Is there anything it specializes in?
Yeah, well, politics. The Post is a very, very political newspaper. It has a huge, huge staff that covers the White House and Congress and all the various departments in Washington, like commerce, labor, education. That's really its specialty. But the Washington Post is a local newspaper, and all good newspapers, I think, are sort of local. The New York Times started as a local newspaper, but it went national. The Washington Post, despite lots of lots of conversations about it, has never distributed beyond Washington, Maryland, and Virginia. So the only way you could get this is on Sundays. You might be able to go to News Haven or one of the stores around here and pick it up, but it's a very, very local paper. And what's fascinating about the web is that the Washington Post, which is fundamentally a very local paper, is read across the world by people who don't live in Washington, and that's a very interesting challenge. And one of the sections I just wanted to talk about for a quick second is this one. This is called the Sunday Source, and it's designed for people like you who are the bane of every newspaper's existence because you don't buy newspapers, you read them online. And so what the Post has done, and if you read the New York Times, you might be familiar with something like Sunday Styles or Thursday Styles, is we've put out these sections that don't have any text so that people like you who don't read can put that. And now, I'm not a huge fan of this section. I like to think people actually read newspapers, but it is really fascinating. You should be watching for more of this. Are you guys aware of all the free weekly tabloids that come out all over the country? If you're in New York, you'll see 5 or 6 of them on the subway. The Washington Post is so worried about this kind of competition, it puts out its own free daily tabloid that competes against the Washington Post. And so much of what happens in American journalism today is about people like you and your reading habits. And so every time you log on to a website and you don't pay for a newspaper, you're sort of what we're dealing with every day. And we have lots of meetings and conversations about it. And it's just really fascinating. You should think about that. And if you're going into journalism, you should think about the way that you tell stories, because we're apparently not doing such a great job that people are buying our papers every day. And so how do we make it interesting and fresh? And it's all stuff you're going to be challenging. You're going to be challenged to deal with as you become journalists. But what I really want to talk about today is interviewing people and interviewing important people, which, as I said, I get to do once in a while. And one of the things I just wanted to do to start this off with is ask any of you if you've had any major challenges in interviewing subjects for your stories, even though they probably might just be people in this community, if any of you have really struggled with an interview, getting someone to talk about something you needed to. Like you talked about interviewing this curator at the Knights of Columbus Museum. Did you have were there any major challenges about that interview? No. Was it boring? Did it go well? Did they give you the quotes you needed?
Yeah, basically like what went into getting the art from Mexico to the United States.
Was one of the major components of the story?
Yes.
Anybody else have a really sucky interview subject that didn't offer any quotes up? What happened to you?
Well, I'm writing an article about this new preppy clothing store opening and the customers
Is it downtown?
It's Taylor, New York, right across from Starbucks. But the customers that I interviewed just were not that smart or anything.
But they did talk to you though.
Yeah, but they were just I asked them to elaborate and they never did,
So you asked them to elaborate. So if they were saying, if you asked them what's your clothing aesthetic, and they said, I wear what I wear, and so what did you try then?
I was just where do you shop and what do you think of those, and what do you think of competition and the location and everything, and they're just it's good.
It's great. Yeah. That's a classic sucky subject. Oh, yeah.
A lot of Yale students tell me to fuck off.
They tell you to piss off for the cameras and the microphones. Okay, that's good. That's very typical. And anybody else? Well, getting told to sort of piss off is a good ritual to be initiated into journalism. It happens all the time. So let me go through this a little bit. You guys all have this in front of you. I don't want to dwell on it too much because I actually only really want to convey a couple of really important things about how you interview people, not who are really on the street, because those are difficult in their own unique way. But sometimes, and hopefully soon in your career, you're going to, if you want to be a journalist, you're going to sit down with somebody who's really sort of powerful and influential, and you're going to be pretty nervous about interviewing them. And there are a couple of things I just want to go over with you about how you interview those people. I think Tom Geyer in his presentation always talks about how to go up to regular people and not upset them and not freak them out. These are people who really can't be freaked out, the kind of people I'm going to be talking to you about. And you're the one who's going to be freaked out. And so how do you interview these people? And just a little bit of background. I cover Walmart, and I cover companies like Target, all the companies you probably know and shop at a lot. And I get to interview their senior executives, their CEOs. And it's never really a pleasant experience for the most part because I'm sort of scared of screwing up. And I'll give you an example. So very recently, the CEO of Walmart came to the Washington Post. We invited him. It was me and a couple of other reporters and editors sitting around the table. It was the publisher of the Washington Post, it was the executive editor of the Washington Post, all sitting there. And no one had told me that I was going to be asking the first question and basically introducing this guy. So suddenly the editor of the editorial page just hands the interview over to me, and I have no idea what to do. And I totally flopped. And I literally just sputtered for about 2 minutes. And you know when your face gets really red and you sort of don't remember what you're saying? And that's what I did. And it was sort of a disaster. But we moved on and we recuperated and we ended up doing a really good interview. And here are some of the reasons why. Before you interview anybody, really anybody at all, but really somebody important, you should go do a fair amount of research. And a fair amount can range anywhere from 5 minutes to like 15 minutes. Given like the access you now have to Google and the archives of any major newspaper. So let's just, I was telling Ray that I did this before. If I were going to interview Ray, who invited me here, I would do a 5-minute clip search and find out that he's won several Italian-American, scholarships before he came to Yale, and that he wrote a letter to the editor of the newspaper in Providence about gambling and what a sad day it would be indeed if this piece of legislation passed. And all you need is something to jumpstart the conversation. You just don't want to walk in cold and say, so I hear you run a really big company here. Tell me a little bit about Walmart. I mean, you want to maximize this opportunity you have with this person. So you want to know something about them and zero in on it and go right for it. But the other thing you don't want to do is you don't want to walk into a room and say, and throw out your hardest possible question in the first couple moments of the interview, because then the person becomes defensive. It's a really awful way of starting an interview. So something we did with the CEO of Walmart was sort of did some research on the way that he goes around all the stores Walmart in the world. And the way that he does this is that he often puts on a disguise, just like a ho-hum t-shirt that says like Nike on it and a pair of shorts, and he shows up in Japan at a Walmart and sort of walks around the store, and he doesn't want anyone to know who he is, lest they act super nice instead of basically snubbing their noses at the CEO, and then he can sort of deal with the service problem they have in the stores. So I asked him about this, and this was a good way to get the interview moving. He's very light on his feet. He started talking about how he does this, how much he enjoys it, and we got a couple of good quotes on that. You really sort of need to ease yourself into an interview. You don't want to set things off in a sort of you against anyone kind of way. And has anyone sort of found that they piss somebody off? It sounds like you may have pissed somebody off in a store. You bugged them. It was annoying to them. So and did you feel like you could ever recover once that happened?
It's like just frustrating because I'm just trying to do my job and they're like, why are you bothering me about shopping? And it's just
Right.
And I don't really know what to say because I'm like trying to see them again. But
Right. I mean, once you lose somebody in an interview, it's basically impossible to get them back. So there's like a number of techniques you can use. I mean, in your case, which I deal with all the time because I have to go into stores across the country and talk to people about their shopping habits when they're rushing, they're annoyed, their kid just failed the test, whatever. You have no idea. You have no idea what these people are going through. So you have to treat it really gingerly. And the thing often that I do with these people is sort of pretend I'm like kind of an idiot. So I walk into the store and say, hey, I'm sure you're really busy. I'm working on a story. I notice you're wearing these premium denim jeans from Walmart. What do you think about the fit? I mean, something that's sort of really informal versus like, I'm working on this story and I'd love for your quote to be in the story. How, something like a little too formal. Something, you want to sort of identify with the person that you're interviewing with. So, I mean, and you never want to lie. But you are allowed to sort of fudge a bit. Like, I really, really love that shirt. In fact, I have one just like it. And then you want to be where people are because ultimately you're really intruding upon their life. And this is a little less true of the senior executive who is being paid to talk to you and is being totally managed by a bunch of PR people and who is perhaps even being surrounded by those people who are watching you and saying, don't answer that question, which is a whole other challenge. But the key thing is to make some sort of connection with people. And my friend Rebecca Dana, who was supposed to be here today but who couldn't be, and I talked on the phone last night and agreed that the most important thing we could possibly say to you is that when you're interviewing people, the most important thing you can do is make a tiny human connection with them. Rather than you being the reporter and they being someone you need in your story, which is the absolute truth. You need them in your story, you know it, that's the game, you need their quote. You really need them to sort of believe that you care. Even if you don't. And let's be honest, there are times that you're just not going to care. but you still have to pretend to. You have to try really hard to make a connection with these people. Okay, and this brings me to back to the Walmart interview. One really good technique is to zero in on something they've written about or something they really care about. And oftentimes I meet with people who've written books or written large articles that I would never read. I would never, ever read these books. They're really boring. But I'll read a chapter of the book, and I'll skim it, and I'll pick up a couple of words. And then I'll go into that room, and I'll say to them, I really thought what you wrote was incredibly fascinating, but I worry that your projections about textile production might be off, given what's going on in Latin America these days. And here's a person who suddenly believes that you know something about what they do and that you care about what they do, when I don't, and I don't. And so this is really important. And I'm not saying that I'm a disingenuous person, but all good reporting basically revolves around you making someone comfortable and showing them that you care. And you want them to understand that you know. You need to let them know that you know something about what they do. I suppose none of you guys have managed to, have you pulled that off yet so far? Anyone? Pretended to read a book, read a chapter that hasn't come up in your work this week? It'll come up. Particularly if you go to a college and you're a college newspaper, there's nothing better than flattering a professor of X, Y, and Z esoteric if you pretend to care and know. And you should care, obviously, because it's important. So we move on to the next couple of things that you really want to do when you're interviewing important people. And this is, actually, we're still on the front page, I just digress. The most important thing that happens that screws up an interview is that somebody starts talking in a really technical way about what they do. And this happens all the time, and it particularly happens in business reporting when, as we like to say, people begin using terms of art, which is really technical things about their industry. And I covered biotechnology for several years at the Washington Post, and this is an industry where scientists basically develop drugs, and it's the most complicated industry I've ever covered, and I really didn't enjoy it at all. And one of the reasons I didn't enjoy it was because people talked in scientific terms. And maybe, and I'm going to zero in on you because you've been the most social so far, someone began talking about art in a very particular way that you didn't understand. Now, one response which a lot of young journalists take is to sort of play along and pretend they know what's going on. And write down the quotes dutifully about profit margins and other complicated things that they don't quite understand. And then they get to their notes, and it's time to write the story, and everything that they have in their notes is kind of Greek, and the average reader couldn't understand it, and they don't even really understand it. And this is a huge mistake. And so one of the biggest concessions you need to be willing to make as a journalist, besides pretending to really care about something that someone else cares about, is admitting that you don't get something, and saying to somebody loudly and clearly that you're really confused. And that's embarrassing, and it's sort of humiliating sometimes. And you have to do it all the time in order to be a good journalist. So this happens with the executive from Walmart. Walmart has a problem with its sales. This is why they're trying really hard to get more upscale to compete with chains like Target. And when we ask about what's wrong with Walmart's sales, they use the word cannibalization, which beyond eating human meat in retail means that you're hurting yourself by doing something. You're cannibalizing your own business. And so I didn't understand this. And I had to keep pressing him, as I do other executives at that company, to really explain what that means. And when they actually get down to explaining it, it's totally fascinating. Walmart has this strange philosophy which says, we can build one of these 200,000 square foot stores and go 1 mile down the road and build another 200,000 square foot store, which doesn't seem to make any sense. I mean, how many people need 200,000 square foot Walmarts within like a 10-minute drive? Well, as it turns out, they build one, does really well, it has like $80 million in sales. They build the other one. One of them falls a little bit, maybe by 20 million. But the other one comes up to the same one as the old one, and they've doubled their sales within that mile radius. It works. They figured it out. They're smart people. But it's hard to understand that. So you have to ask them what cannibalization means. And they tell you that, and you not only understand it, you suddenly have a new story idea. And one of these days, I'd like to go to Arizona, where they've really done this very, very successfully, and write a story about how that works, why you need 2 Walmarts within a mile. It's actually a very interesting story. And so by asking him to really explain this, I really understand it, and I get another really good story idea out of it. And so this is something you need to approach in all your journalism. And some people actually think it's better to pretend you're more stupid than you are in every interview you do, so that people overcompensate and really begin explaining things. And sometimes people are just hopelessly bad at giving quotes. And they just can't utter a quote. And you look at your notes and you have nothing. In that case, you just use snippets of quotes and you have to work around it. I mean, sometimes that'll just happen. But the other thing to do is to sort of just know that your interview subject stinks and go to somebody else. So I'm not going to pretend that every interview goes so well that you get something usable. But if you stick to the general philosophy that by playing kind of stupid and continuing to ask for explanations, you're going to get to something in English that you can use, which is really important. One of the sort of huge mistakes that young journalists make all the time is they quote people in ways that are really confusing. And they overquote people. And so you really want to have as much usable material as possible in your interview by the end. So that I think is also as important as making a human connection. This is the fourth thing about getting people to make news. May not have applied when you were doing your work this week, but it's really important when you get to a daily newspaper, particularly in a month like August when there's no news, and you need news. And people can break news without even realizing it. At the Washington Post and other newspapers, we call this committing news. It's like committing a felony or a crime. Sometimes you can get people to commit news without them even realizing that you've done it. And perhaps some of you guys have done this without realizing it because you didn't know it was news, because maybe you don't know the area so well, but you're always interviewing people with an eye towards getting them to say something that's going to just make a story. And when somebody who's important says something new and fresh about what it is they do, and it's unprecedented, and it tells you something new about the company, or the direction it's going in, or the university and the direction it's going in, or the high school and the renovations that are going on, then that's news. And you'll read in major newspapers all over the country stories that just begin with a sentence like, the President of the United States said yesterday that he regards North Korea as an enemy of the state, which said during the interview probably didn't amount to very much, but then somebody looked at their notes, compared it with what he'd said previously, and said, damn, we have a really big story here, just because he said something. He committed news. And so when we had the CEO of Walmart come to the Washington Post, we wanted him to say something very particular. And there's a lot of strategy that goes into this. He had come to the Washington Post right after Walmart had, in some people's minds rather offensively, closed a store in Canada that had unionized. And to those who support unions, this is like a pretty outrageous thing to have done. It's people's legal right to form a union, and what does Walmart do in response? Walmart is sort of rabidly anti-union sometimes. They close the store. They wouldn't even let people try to organize and negotiate a contract. And so we knew this was going to be our hot-button issue to try to get him to talk about. And he knew it was going to be our hot-button issue to try to talk about. So he was going to dodge it, and we were going to keep coming back at him. And everyone knows how this game works, but you've got to do it. You've got to try to break news. So we kept throwing this question at him 3 or 4 or 5 different times until he finally said something about it. And what he said was not that interesting. He said the store wasn't going to be doing well with a union. But then he kind of went on to say something a little more interesting. And he sort of revealed a lot about himself and about the company. And if you look at what we actually ended up publishing, this is what he said. He said, I'm not going to read it. It's not a fascinating quote. But when he gets down to the last graph, where we say, and this is us sort of puffing ourselves up, in his first interview since they announced this, we've got to sort of establish that we got him first. He goes on to say that he won't do this to be altruistic. It just doesn't work that way. So instead of saying what he said and saying only that, he sort of revealed himself to be kind of a cowboy when it comes to unions. He doesn't think you should be nice to unions. And then he goes on to say, it just doesn't work that way. And this is sort of nuanced, but here's a CEO of the world's largest corporation kind of being a little bit of a jerk. And it's very interesting. And so this is why we ran the quote the way we did. And this is what you're able to do when you really press people to say something. And it's not always pleasant to do, and a lot of the times they're going to push back. And sometimes you can say, let's come back to this later. We don't need to talk about it now. But you shouldn't leave that room until you've gotten some response to the main question you need answered that might create news. And even if the answer is, I won't answer that, there's your quote. Then every reader you know knows that you're smart enough to have tried to get the important question asked and answered or unanswered, and then they know what to make of this person who didn't answer your question. And this is something you really should think about when interviewing people. Okay, the next couple of things are really, really simple, but I think are some of the most important things that can happen. Oh, I forgot something else actually this is why I brought this in. One of the techniques that people at the Washington Post use and teach young reporters is that when you go in an interview with someone who's important and you've done a lot of research, it's often quite worthwhile to just bring in a file. It might not be full of the papers that you use to do the research, but you sort of tuck it under your arm and you walk into the room and you put it down and you start doing your interview. And what does this say to you that I brought this in to the interview? Does it say anything?
That you really did your research?
That I really did my research. And let's say it's kind of a showdown interview where I have a lot of tough questions and I've really done my homework or I really haven't. And I bring this in and I have it under my arm and I say, hey, it's really great to meet you, thanks a lot. And I keep this right by my side and I kind of ruffle through it. It says opinions and editorials, beat reporting, application. But I have it here. And it's intimidation is what it is. It's a way of saying, basically, don't mess with me. I've done my research. I know everything there is to know. It's sort of a favor that I'm here, being so nice to you. I've got it all. I'm going to write it all. So you might as well start telling me what you know. And this is a really good technique. And I can't say I have to do this all the time, but I did do it once recently with the CEO of a big supermarket company that's related to Stop and Shop. It's the big, sister chain in Washington. And we had lots and lots of memos from employees who were unhappy at the company that sort of leaked us. And when we went in there, I sort of made it clear, even though I hadn't brought them all and I deleted all the names because I didn't want them to, God forbid, open them up and say, oh my God, this person gave them the memos. So you never want to bring memos with names of the people who brought them to you, into a meeting. This is important. You don't want to get people in trouble. But I made it very clear during these several hour-long interviews that I had it all here. And that I wasn't going to walk away from this interview without strong responses to some serious stuff in the story because I had it. And I wasn't going to, I overcompensate because I'm 25. And when I walk into the room of somebody who's an executive at a company, I'm really scared, as I've told you. And they're not. And the only way to sort of reverse that intimidation is to be really prepared and to let them know you've done your homework. And this is important. And this applies to just about anything in journalism. But this also brings me back to what you do right after the interview and how you conduct yourself. Because when the interview's over, a lot of journalists kind of cut and run. They're out. It's over. They never deal with the person they interview again. And I think that's a really bad idea because the person that you've just interviewed is someone that you might not need for a week or 2 weeks or 3 years. And then suddenly you really need them. And if you have A, let them down with your story, B, not let them respond to something in the story, or C, just never bothered to ask them what they thought about the story, then they're far less inclined to help you the next time. And in beat reporting, which these guys have done, and which I do, in which you deal with a lot of the same people in a very small community that's very gossipy and talks to each other, you need to be really careful. You need to be really thoughtful about how you basically maintain relationships. It's a lot like high school, actually, and being careful about gossiping to people, and being careful how you treat someone in your class who's a total nerd now is going to end up being really important and handsome down the line, and you're going to need them, or you might want them for marriage, for work, for whatever. It's exactly the same. And so a couple of things that you do after the story that I think are just exceedingly important. One is that you arrange to speak to somebody again so that when you're writing your story and you're inevitably finding a hole in your story, you can go back to them. Has anyone found a hole in their story already that they wish they could plug and they've been having trouble getting in touch with that person, even for a day? Has that happened to any of you guys? Well, then you're obviously much better reporters than I am. Not a single person has had that happen? Where you've struggled with a hole in your story, a quote that doesn't make any sense? Well, it happens a lot in my line of work, and you should set up a follow-up interview. And even if at that interview you basically kind of go over a few facts that you know, but you want to just clarify a little bit, this is a really huge way of building confidence among the people that you're dealing with who suddenly think that you're committed to figuring out something down to its last detail. And this becomes really important to people. The other important thing, which I never do, but I always tell people they should do, is to get people's cell phone numbers and email addresses, because these are things you need when you're suddenly in a pinch. Something big happens, and you don't have someone's cell phone number. The newspaper comes out every day, You can't wait till tomorrow. You need to reach them. You need their email addresses, you need their cell phone numbers. It's something you really should get in the habit of asking people about. And then, this is also really important, just thank people when a story is over. Thank them by an email, thank them by a phone call. It really means a lot to people. It basically takes nothing of you to do. And regular people are thrilled when this happens. They can't believe that a Washington Post reporter wants to call them back and ask them, to tell them thank you. And in some cases, ask them what they think of the story. And to be honest, a lot of the times, they really like the story. They're thrilled. They're like jumping up and down. They've clipped it out. They put it on their refrigerator. In the case of an executive, it goes into his file as like an important example of how he's gotten good press for the company or how he managed an interview really well. I'm sorry to be so corporately oriented, but I cover business. But it applies to everything, whether you're covering government or a college or a high school. Give people some feedback. Let them give you some feedback. And you'll build a relationship with somebody. I can't tell you how many regular people who work for major companies in retail, because I've been nice to them and I've called them back and I've listened to them rant and rave about the stupidest, craziest things, suddenly learn something really important. Because in every sphere that people work, they see documents, they see memos, they know something. They know something you can't possibly know because they work somewhere you don't work. And they have access to things you don't have access to. If you're nice to them, they want to help you. And if you don't burn them, then they begin to trust you. And then they call you at midnight when you're sleeping. And they tell you something important. And you answer the phone. And a really important relationship builds. And if any of you guys have read about the really fascinating relationship that developed between Bob Woodward and Deep Throat, Mark Felt, the really fascinating thing that happened to that relationship is that it started off in a very personal nature. And it grew. And Bob Woodward went to Mark Felt's house. And he had coffee with him. And he didn't just use him, although some people think that he did. He built a really strong personal connection with this guy. So much so that the guy would meet him in a parking garage in the basement, in Virginia at 2 a.m. in the morning and scribble things in his New York Times. These relationships are personal in nature. They're not, after a while, they cease to be professional. And that's okay, obviously, as long as you're abiding by all the ethics that these people have taught you when you've been here this week. So this is really important. So again, just to recap, I've been talking a lot. I know you want to get back to work. The two most important things you can do as a journalist interviewing people is to make a really strong human connection of some kind. Whether it's the fact that you like purple, and he likes purple, or she likes purple, something really silly like that, or because you've discovered some truly interesting shared passion for what it is you're writing about, you want to do that on some level. It's really important. And the second thing you want to do is be open to criticism, follow up with people, and develop some sort of meaningful relationship with them so that they'll help you in the future. And you'll be a better journalist for having lots of people in whatever community, industry, government you're covering who know things and will share them with you. Because ultimately, no matter where you are, you're covering a community of people who you're sort of responsible for keeping happy and being accurate in describing. So anyway, these are important goals for you as you become journalists. Anyway, that's my presentation. I hope it was helpful. Do any of you guys have any questions about either interviewing or the Washington Post and career stuff? Anything I can be helpful with? Yeah?
What's like the best way to introduce yourself?
To people you're interviewing?
Yeah. Like just regular people.
Regular people. Well, the best thing, did Tom Geyer talk about not taking out your notebook? Yeah. Okay, this is really important. And let me give you another parallel. If you ever have a tape recorder, it's like the last thing you bring out when you're interviewing somebody, because it just really throws people off. They're like, I'm going to be on that tape recorder forever. That's a lot to ask from somebody. So, just like the notebook, what I often do, and I'm in a store, I'm in like a Walmart. I did this a couple weeks ago. Usually someone's in a store. Let's say they're in a store and they have a shopping cart full of stuff. I walk up to them and I say, hey, I'm in Walmart working on a story for the Washington Post. I see that you've bought a couple of things from the women's sportswear line, and that's going to be a subject of my story. I'm really interested in understanding your shopping habits, what you buy, where you buy it. I think it would really add a lot of interesting color to my story. And I can't imagine that approach not working unless you're kind of brusque and obnoxious. I mean, people, the other sort of, it's not a dirty secret, it's pretty well known. People want to talk about their lives. And so you have to go pretty far in the wrong direction before you really upset someone. Unless they've been burned by a journalist in the past, or, in Washington, I have this joke I always use when people are not helpful to me. Oftentimes I'll interview somebody for about 10 or 15 minutes, and sometimes I decide to ask them for their name in the beginning. Other times I ask them at the end, just based on how things are flowing. And at the end, sometimes they say, oh, no, I can't give you my name. You can't use my name. Have you guys had this so far? Yeah, it happens all the time. My first reaction is to punch them, because I've wasted 15 minutes. But my second reaction is a little joke I use, because we're in Washington and because people know this. I say, oh, let me guess, you work for the CIA. And they say, no, I don't work for the CIA. And I say, well, then what do you have to worry about? Or some version of that. Because at the Washington Post, we basically have a policy that says the only way that we grant anonymity is when you're sharing national security secrets. I mean, how important are you that you can't give me your name to talk about the sportswear clothing you're buying from Walmart? I usually play with that theme. I say, look, this has been a great interview. I really like what you've said. I really think it's going to add to the story. But the Post doesn't let us give you anonymity unless you're breaking the story of Watergate, and what you tell us leads to the indictment of the president. So are you okay with that? And they say, they usually by that point realize they're being silly, and they give you their name. Now some people it just won't happen. They won't give you your name, and you get over it. I'll be honest, if you read my clips, you'll see a 70-30 split between women and men. I enjoy interviewing women more. I think they're friendlier. They're generally more evocative. They're more willing to talk about their shopping experience. It's a huge flaw of mine, but you kind of begin to learn by looking at people over time who's going to make a good interview subject and who's not. And since you're interviewing everyday people on the street, you don't need there's no right person. There's just a person who's willing to talk to you. And you develop a sort of sixth sense about this. For me, it's women in their 40s. They just love to talk. For other people, it's if you're an absolutely gorgeous woman, which I'm not, it might be men in their 50s. I mean, it depends. And you play with all the assets that you have within reason. So the answer is that you try and try again. But the other thing to do is to not basically this is why Tom Geyer is a great journalist. I mean, the last thing you want to do is force someone into an uncomfortable situation. And I'll stop interviews if I have a sense that the person just is not the right subject for the interview. Or I'll pretend to scribble. Did anyone go over that with you? You want to be nice to somebody, so you just kind of scribble literally squiggly lines, but you just know it's not going anywhere. You don't want to be rude to them, so you just kind of scribble. There are all sorts of little tricks like that. Anything else? Questions? Yeah.
Is there ever a situation where it would be okay to show your source the story before you run it?
That really depends on the newspaper. I mean, the blanket answer is no, but then there are all sorts of shades of gray. And let me explain a couple instances of that. So when I covered biotechnology, which was the pharmaceutical industry, really, really complicated science, the worst thing that I could do is write a story based off interviews and try to get into the science of something that I didn't understand. So what I would do is often call a scientist who I work with on the story, somebody at the company I was writing about, and I would read him a paragraph and say, does this sound right? Is this accurate? Is this wrong? Is it, is some nuance off? I would never read the whole story to somebody because, his quote to you, her quote to you, whatever, is not something that you really need to get into a debate about. You don't want to do that. And quotes are a very special area where somebody often says to us at the Post, I'll only do this interview if you'll read me back my quotes, and you'll only use those quotes. And it's sort of an ad hoc decision every time if you're going to do that, but generally we discourage that because every day that somebody reads the Post, there's a sort of informal contract you have with your readers that this is all pretty organic. I did this interview, it showed up in a quote, I wrote this story, it's got my byline on it. There's an understanding about how this all works. And nowhere does it say in here that the people that I've interviewed got to hear their quotes read back to them. So you want to keep a certain level of transparency between the reader and you. And until we decide as an industry or a newspaper or a section that we're going to do that as an official policy, we're not being really honest with our readers about how things work. And that's ultimately like the test. Are you being honest with your reader? And so the thing you don't ever want to do is get something wrong. So be honest with your reader. Check things with people. If you're uncomfortable reading a whole section of something back to someone, then you could just say, I've said these kinds of things. Is it right? I mean, you develop. There are no hard and fast rules in journalism except you don't make things up. You don't let people buy things for you. I mean, there are really basic ones, but then everything else is a little more complicated. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is it possible for a reporter not to work in a certain section, to sort of jump around from like business, sports, or whatever?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, at the Yale Daily News, if you come to a place like Yale and you work for a newspaper, in college you can write for any number of sections. I can write and have written for the Washington Post style section, which is somewhere. It's our sort of, style, here you go. Which as you can tell is like a really fun section. It's about fashion, social life. I wrote a story about Jack Welch, who was the CEO of General Electric. He'd begun having affairs with the editor of the Harvard Business Review, and then his wife, returning the favor, began sleeping with her chauffeur. And so we had a really fun time with that story. Which was very fun. So I wrote that for style. And at major newspapers, if you have a beat, you're ultimately responsible for that beat. And if you have extra time, you can write for other sections. And there are a lot of papers where it's a very fluid thing, where you can do something for 2 years and then go to another section, be a sports writer, go be a Metro reporter. But typically, you want to do a beat for like a good number of years to get to know people, and to get to have sources, and to begin to break stories, and get to really know what you're doing. I mean, it's taken me about 2 years to understand Walmart to a degree where I can write really substantial stories. It just takes a while. You start reading books. You start interviewing peripheral people who share things with you. It takes time. So you don't want to be one of those people, ultimately, in journalism who knows nothing about anything and just jumps all over the place. So you do ultimately need to sort of settle into something you can do for it, even if it's just a year, 2 years, and then jump around and do other things. So to answer the question, you can do anything you want, any amount of time, at every stop, along the way. But to do really good journalism, like this guy who covered Walmart for the Wall Street Journal and wrote a really substantial book that is really fascinating and that I'm getting a lot out of, you need ultimately to sort of spend some time on a beat covering something. So, okay. Anyway, good luck with your stories. I wanted to give everybody my business card in case you ever have questions about anything, or you're interested in something like the Washington Post internship, which is really, really great if you stay in journalism, and that's how I got to the Post. I was an intern one summer. So here are my cards. I'm really happy to just have you guys take them and email me at any time with any question, call me, whatever. Journalism is a really great community of people who are really, really helpful to each other and who owe a lot of their careers to people who mentored them. And so I owe a lot of my career to people who went to Yale and work at the Yale Daily News and the SJP program, which I did, and others. So if you ever have any questions, please send them my way. I hope that was helpful.